It is always truly a pleasure to come back to City College because it's always like a homecoming for me. I got my bachelor's degree here. I spent some time up at University of Rochester, so there are two of my professors here, not only Professor Alfano, but Professor Boyd. And I finished my PhD with Professor Alfano in 1988. And what I'd like to do is to share with you some of the lessons that I learned from Professor Alfano that has enabled me to navigate my way through a professional career at Bell Communications Research and then as an academician or professor at the University of Central Florida. So far, so good? Yes. So now, as you may or may not know, I'm sort of an ultra-fast guy that does it with semiconductor lasers. So it's a rather interesting area, but I'd like to share with you some very interesting stories. And the first one, I'm going to say, diode lasers are like men. What the heck does that mean? Well, let me explain it to you. Here it is. I had just started out as a young researcher, professor, and I'm at one of the Optical Society of America's conference, and they have a rump session on the Wednesday night where they're talking about compact sources of ultra-short pulses for potential applications in everything. And this is about the early 90s or so. And on this esteemed panel, they had folks from the mode-locked fiber laser community, from the diode pump laser community, etc. But there was no one representing the ultimate in compact sources, the semiconductor laser field. So they continued to talk about how great their relative areas of research are, and that's wonderful. And at the very end, I sort of raised my hand. And they say, yes, sir, what is your comment? So I said, gee, everybody up here is a solid-state laser guy, diode pump fibers. Where's the representation from the semiconductor laser community? Well, one of the esteemed panel members, a very elderly stateswoman, sort of stands up and looks at me and says, gee, these semiconductor lasers, they're really never going to do anything useful for the ultrafast community. These devices are just crappy. The mode profile is poor. They're very noisy devices. You really can't do anything with them. But I said, but surely these devices are already in the ground, piping the internet. It was just started getting going at the time. And I tried to get a better feeling for why they didn't embrace this technology. So she says, well, gee, again, these diode lasers, you know, they're just useful for pointers and pumping, etc. So I said, but see, you even yourself admit that they're important because you use your diode lasers for pumping your fibers and solid-state lasers. So I could think she was getting a little annoyed with me. And so she looks at me over her glasses and said, look, you know, guys, all you do is grunt and point. That's all a semiconductor laser is. You grunt and you point. So I said, I still don't understand. And then she really got furious at me. And she said, look, young man, these diode lasers are just dirty, dirty, dirty pigs. You know, they remind me of you men. You're both dirty and you're only useful for one thing, pumping. So at this point, I was certainly beaten down in front of the entire ultrafast community at the OSA meeting. But I thought to myself and said, gee, Professor Alfano taught me a very important lesson. And that lesson is, he would say, Peter, listen with your good ear. And what I mean by that is, this person had basically laid out all of the critical issues that one had to solve if you really wanted to make ultrafast laser technology with semiconductor lasers a reality. And those were things like, you really can't make short pulses, you really can't make high energy pulses, these things are noisy, etc. There's no applications except for pumping. And so, the first thing I want to say is listen with your good ear. This is very, very important, especially for the young students out there. Because many times when you're discussing your research with people, they're very quick to point out the holes in your research activity. Oh, this won't work because of, this won't work because of that. And those are really the signs that you have to grab onto and say, these are the things I need to do in order to become successful in what my vision is going to become. It's important to have a vision. So lesson number one, listen with your good ear, right? You always would tell me that, listen with your good ear. At that point, when he told me that, I really didn't know what the hell it meant. But now I really understood. And so the first problem I tried to solve was this thing called the pulse width dependent gain saturation problem. And what basically it is very simple. In semiconductor lasers, we all know the nonlinearities are huge. And as the pulse width gets short, if it's going to propagate through a semiconductor optical amplifier, remember you're resonant with the band gap, but two-photon absorption becomes very, very strong as the peak power goes up. And what happens when you start to get two-photon absorption, it's sort of like free carrier absorption, and you're reducing the number of carriers that are allowed to participate in the gain. And when the pulse widths get short, right at the peak of the pulse, the gain drops. So if you try to generate a femtosecond pulse and pass it through a semiconductor gain medium, the nonlinearities conspire against you to rip the pulse apart. Fundamental physics, you would like to think you cannot beat that. But you can. And we came up with an idea, we came up with an idea called sort of this dispersion managed breathing mode lock laser. Let me tell you what that is. Very simply, if you basically can't support short pulses in here, don't fight it. So let's assume we have some saturable absorber by which pulses can be made short. You put it through some dispersion stretcher, stretch the pulses out to reduce the peak power. You amplify the bejesus out of this thing. It's like 30 dB gain. You take the pulses out, you recompress, you go into the saturable absorber, it makes it shorter. We call this thing breathing mode because the pulse basically is compressed. You exhale, stretch, amplify, recompress. Exhale, inhale, exhale, breathing mode. The pulse is basically stretching and compression. With that kind of concept or architecture, we were able to generate, at the time, the world's shortest pulses from a semiconductor laser, about 180 femtoseconds in duration. Now, when my student broke that record, he was super happy. And he went to Clio and reported this, and someone said to the student, gee, that's great, but it looks like you built this thing on a 10-foot optical table, because these are basically classic Tracy grating stretchers and compressors. So he looks sort of puzzled because the guy says, you know, semiconductor lasers are really there for integration. But you built this thing on a 10-foot optical table. What are you going to do about that? So my student was a little shocked, and so I kind of rushed to his rescue and said, well, gee, you know, right now they're just starting to make chirped fiber Bragg gratings, and one could envision using the stretching and compression of a chirped fiber Bragg grating and put it into a little box, et cetera, et cetera. But to give you a feel, you know, now we're able to make mode lock lasers very, very, very much integratable. And here's a picture of an integrated mode lock laser, which has a both gain section, a saturable absorption section, and a passive section by which you could do FM mode locking, AM mode locking, or actually shift the frequency combs like you would do in a carrier envelope offset stabilized laser. This is just a mode lock laser that runs at about 22 gigahertz. There's a simple optical mode spectrum, short pulses, LI and IV curve, and showing you that you can move the frequency combs around simply by injecting into a passive section. The feature is, getting back to breathing mode, we are now funded by DARPA to literally take that 10-foot optical table and put it on a 8mm chip. And so here's where we would have gain. I don't know why the display looks messy. This is the gain. Here's a saturable absorber, here's a modulator, and this thing is a multi-mode interference filter by which optical pulses come in here. We design the geometry here just right so that half of the light goes in here, half of the light goes in here. We impose a phase shift between the two so that when the light gets reflected from the chirped waveguide gratings, these things basically allow us to do stretching or compression. The pulses then come out and go through this waveguide. They come into this multi-mode interference filter. They basically split. We go in here, we stretch or recompress. They interfere constructively. And so this device then becomes that 10-foot optical table on a chip which is about 4 millimeters long. And it's And to give you a feel, we did that breathing mode laser about 10 years ago. So it's important to have a vision and keep honing on it to make it a reality. And so lesson number 1, remember, listen with your good ear. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is this concept that Professor Alfano taught me, is about when the physics doesn't work your way, don't try to work against the physics, work with it. So in some ways I call this on your head thinking. And so I will tell you where I got that from. So let me give you the story. So I'm at Creole, and some guys from one of the DOD agencies come to me, the guys in dark suits and dark glasses, and they say, gee, we understand you're the guy who makes short pulses with semiconductor lasers. And I said, yeah, I'm that guy, I do reasonably well. And he said, look, we would like to fund a project where we could make semiconductor lasers blow holes through walls. Can you do that? And so I said, oh, no way, you can't do that. And I proceeded to give him a list of why you couldn't do it. Lack of energy storage, small mode volume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you know what the guy said to me? He said, wow, that sounds like the basis of an excellent proposal. So you know what? While that guy was not a student of Professor Alfano's, but he certainly knows how to listen with his good ear. That is for sure. So he said, you know, we've got $12 million to make this happen. So I said, let me go back and think about it. And so I went back, I thought about the problem, and I came back and I said, you know, I think we may have a solution. So I think the joke goes, so I said, oh, you know, we couldn't do this. So he said, you know, we got 12 million bucks. I said, oh, Houston, we have a solution. Right, someone's going to offer you 12 million bucks to do a project. We're going to find a solution. So I go away, I come back, and I come up with this concept called XCPA. X like the letter X, CPA for chirp pulse amplification. So for all you short pulse guys, we all know what chirp pulse amplification is, but X stands for the word extreme. And so it's a little bit different physics from CPA. The concept is similar, but what it's achieving is something radically different. And so what the heck is XCPA? Well, let me just kind of show you. If I have a semiconductor optical amplifier, and these things are tiny, tiny devices, a couple hundred microns long. They're tiny, tiny devices. The mode area is like 5 microns. If I were to come in with a short optical pulse here and try to amplify it, and if the pulse duration is much shorter than the storage time, and I come in with pulse energy on the order of the saturation energy, I'm not going to get anything out. I'm just going to get basically the same amount of what I put in. But gain is 1. I can't do anything. However, XCPA is a rather interesting regime where we cannot effectively change the storage time of the medium, but what we can do is change the pulse duration that's going in. And what we're going to want to do is take this short pulse, shove it into a chirp fiber Bragg grating, even if the pulse energy is on the order of the saturation energy of the semiconductor optical amplifier. But what we're going to do is stretch the pulse so its temporal duration is orders of magnitude longer than the storage time. Semiconductor lasers is very easy to achieve. The storage time in a semiconductor optical amplifier might be 100 picoseconds to a nanosecond. It's about a foot long. A chirp fiber Bragg grating you can buy off the shelf now, where the fibers might be 1.5 meters, 2 meters long, and you can effectively stretch the pulse to over 10 nanoseconds. So you're literally taking a femtosecond pulse, which is about, you know, its temporal duration has a thickness of about that of a business card, and you're going to stretch it out to the size of about three of these tables put together. And so when you do that, the pulse comes in here, you stretch the bejesus out of this thing, you amplify it and compress it, and you're easily able to beat the saturation energy limit defined by the storage time, because you're basically converting this short pulse into something that looks like it's CW. This concept is so sexy, we call it XCPA because it's X-rated. Boom, boom. boy, you're a tough audience. You must be New Yorkers. Oh, you can't? I will scream louder. I will do my best. So generally, the general concept is to take short pulses and stretch it out so it's CW laser. So you're operating this this device as it's a CW laser. And this is the real trick you can use to beat the physics of Mother Nature. With that, we built a simple system, mode-locked oscillator, running at 300 megahertz. We pulse pick down to about 100 megahertz. We take the output light, we shove it into a chirp fiber bride grating. The reds get reflected first. The blues go all the way in and get reflected. We come out, go through a Faraday rotator, send the light this way. We amplify, we come back in, we compress this way. The reds go all the way in and get compressed here. The blues get compressed here. Out comes the optical pulse. We put a little bit of additional asymmetry on the stretching and compression up here. So we come out here and we compensate for that additional pre-stretch which is here, which we don't show, because if we don't do this, we will blow the fiber up. And with that, we were able to get output pulses of about a nanojoule in energy. Now let's put this in perspective. A semiconductor laser is a picojoule device, picojoule. But we're able to do femtosecond pulses with nanojoules in this configuration. We took this one step further and had one additional amplifier and amplified the light to 1.6 microjoules. And for those who build lasers, that's pretty significant. I showed this to my DARPA guy. I was 3 dB off of what the spec was, and the guy gave me a new body part. But the key feature is, if you're able to have a vision and work with the physics, not against it, you can really make substantial advances. And we improved the overall gain of the system of about 1 million, from picojoules to microjoules. So, lesson 2, remember, work with the physics, not against it. So why do I call this thing on your head thinking? Because when I was a student, you know, Professor Alfano was like, Peter, you're great, but you're freaking all over the place. You're like incoherent white light, which is all over the place. We need you to organize your phase. We want you to become phase coherent. We want to transform limited pulse. We want high peak power. You want to focus, dig in deep and focus. Correct, dig in deep and focus. So I started thinking, oh gee, femtosecond pulses look like that. And if I'm using lasers to drill holes, it basically looks exactly opposite. So I said, oh gee, maybe I just need to think about my problems sort of by looking at it in a completely different way. Standing on your head. It's very much like when you're at home, and if you're looking for, you know, if you've got kids or whatever and they lost the toys and you lost your change, it's always underneath the couch somewhere. But if you're looking around, you can't find it. But if you sort of stand on your head and look around the living room and you start seeing all the debris and stuff that's underneath the couch, man, it looks like a completely different world. That is what I call on your head thinking. That's lesson number 2, very, very important. So the lesson I learned was to turn the problem around. And so what we did here was in trying to amplify pulses directly, we said let's convert short pulses to CW light, where we literally fill the time slot. And then you can just continue to amplify to your heart's desire and generate the results that you'd like to have. Okay, third one, I'm a young guy, I go up to DARPA, and I have this idea of making clumps or clusters of mode-locked channels from a semiconductor laser. And I go up there, and the guy who's the program manager, I knew this guy, he was a division director back at Belcor, so he was very happy to see me. Hi, Peter, how you doing? Life's great, blah, blah, blah. Show me what you got. So I opened up my little folder, and I showed, I want to make multi-wavelength mode-locked lasers. So he looks at my diagram and says, it won't work. I said, but wait a second, I haven't even showed you anything. So I show my next view graph, and it looks and he says, it won't work. So obviously, the trip back to Orlando was very, very difficult. Long for me. But I didn't give up. I didn't give up. And I worked hard, and I was able to make this thing work. So then I was giving a talk at Clio Pacific Rim, an invited talk, and one of the other division program managers saw this and said, wow, Peter, this is great. Does Bob know about this? I said, yes, he does. He says it won't work. When I got back from Japan, I had a call from DARPA. And I've been funded ever since. Important lesson. Now, when I say WDM versus WMD, the simple joke is this. So I was doing this back, in the sort of like 2000 time frame. And so we had just had a newly elected president. His first name was George. And he went to Alan Greenspan and he says, Alan, the economy is going gangbusters, and the last thing I want to do is screw it up. What's the most important thing in the economy? He says, gee, George, don't you know? And this was at the time where there was a telecom boom. And he says, gee, it's WDM, of course. And George says, oh, yeah, that's right, I forgot. WDM, thanks. So George is making his walk back down from Capitol Hill, and he's walking down the sidewalk, la, 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 saying, WDM, WDM, WDM. He trips over a crack and starts walking WMD, 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 and he goes to Dick Cheney and says, Dick, the key to the economy is WMD. The rest is history. Tough crowd, tough crowd, tough crowd. So we sort of make frequency combs from semiconductor lasers. We do this thing by cavity engineering. We all know that the cavity Q of a semiconductor laser is extremely small. So what we do is we have a semiconductor gain medium with the optical fiber cavity. The axial mode spacing of this might be 10 megahertz. Classic, very long fiber cavity. We then put an ultra-low expansion quartz etalon in there. That is a true secondary optical reference. It has a delta L over L per degree C of 10 to the minus 9. These things are super stable. And what we do is we ensure or make sure that the axial mode spacing of this 10 megahertz cavity is harmonically related to the axial mode spacing of this etalon. This etalon is 10 gigahertz. The cavity spacing is 10 megahertz. And so literally, when you align these cavities together, you basically get line widths from your laser, which are narrow, owing to the long storage time of the fiber cavity. However, you get the extremely wide spacing associated with the axial mode spacing of the etalon. And this is the trick that you can use to make extremely ultra-low noise, stable frequency combs from diode lasers. Let's see what we have. We have, axial mode line widths that are less than 1 kilohertz. A diode laser line width is typically 10 megahertz. So we are 10 to the 4 less than that. We have integrated timing jitter of around 300 attoseconds. This is extremely stable for any kind of laser system. To give you a feel what that means, this is a single sideband phase noise plot. And that basically says in a 1 second interval, if I had my mode lock pulses running at 10 gigahertz, these things are separated by 100 picoseconds. 1 second of light, I could wrap around the Earth 7.5 times. And if I took a look at the displacement of the last pulse and the first pulse, it's going to be randomly jittering around 1/5 the wavelength of light. Extremely stable. These things now fit in a simple 19-inch rack mountable box. We build these things and deliver them to DARPA so they can be used on advanced photonic-assisted A to D converted systems. That's the ultra-low expansion quartz etalon. Here's our optical frequency comb sitting in C-band to give you a feel for where we are now. Or there's a typical box. It's sitting in a box which is both thermally and acoustically isolated. The etalon sits here. We've got a couple of modulators here. This thing is stabilized using what we call intercavity Pound-Drever Hall. We all might be familiar with what Pound-Drever Hall stabilization is. John Hall won the Nobel Prize in 2005 for his activity in laser spectroscopy. We're the first to show how we can use Pound-Drever Hall inside an active laser system as opposed to doing it externally. We now are running this thing in C-band. We now have literally on the order of 400 comb lines at 10 gigahertz, 500 comb lines at 8 gigahertz, sitting right in the smack center of C-band. C-band extends from here to here. These plots are basically an intercavity filter that we incorporate to both manage dispersion and gain flatness to basically ensure that we have wide stretched combs. So now the concept there was when my program manager at DARPA said this could not be done, I did not give up. I had a vision that this could be doable. Although my architecture that I originally proposed is a little different now. But for the young students, if you have a vision, never ever give up. So the 3 lessons we've learned so far, number 1, listen with your good ear. Because when people are telling you why your experiment won't work, they're telling you exactly what you need to do to be successful. That's very, very important. Young students, when people tell us, oh, this won't work, we get discouraged. And that's a problem. But when Professor Alfano taught me to listen with my good ear, it enabled me to look at something like that, which potentially you would think was very negative, and turn it around to be a very positive thing. Lesson number 2, on your head thinking. You're all over the place, you're all over the place, you're incoherent. It's like white light. It's great, short coherence time, but you want to organize the phase. You want to be like a single cycle femtosecond pulse. Well, that's great, but you also want to dig deep. So digging deep is like this. The way you take a femtosecond pulse that looks like this and make it look like this, you stand on your head. Turn the problem around. If you can't work with if you can't have try not to work against the physics if it's not working with you. And third, never, ever, ever give up. So I think I'm almost done. We talked about pumps and pointers. You know, laser diodes are simply just pointing devices. And the concept was you can't do a darn thing with semiconductor lasers unless they're pointers or pumps. And so now I want to show you what we're doing with pulse shaping. Pulse shaping is a concept by which we take light from a mode-locked laser. Again, these axial modes had better not move around. They got to be super stable. We're going to disperse them, and we're going to, instead of sending the light to a liquid crystal spatial light modulator, we're not going to do that. That's old pulse shaping. That's 20 years old. We are revolutionizing pulse shaping by replacing the liquid crystal SLM with an array of vertical cavity surface emitting lasers, VCSELs. What we are going to do is to take each axial mode and injection lock the VCSEL. And by tweaking or modulating the current in the VCSEL, you're imparting phase modulation. So this becomes a spatial light, a phase-only SLM, but the key feature is liquid crystal SLMs on your best day might be updatable at a kilohertz rate. These things can be updatable at a 10 gigahertz rate. I don't think it'll ever be possible for liquid crystal SLMs to be clocked at 10 gigahertz. If someone is in the audience that can, you know, confirm or deny, please let me know. So, what we are doing, we take combs at 6 gigahertz or 12 gigahertz, we split them out with the demux, we injection lock a VCSEL array, we modulate the currents, and we're able to do pulse shaping. Let's take a look at what we have. Oh, also notice, we inject microwatts of power. The amount of power coming out of a VCSEL is milliwatts. So you get what we call negative insertion loss, or simply gain in this process. Pulse shaping with gain. And more importantly, if the combs are at, let's say, 12 gigahertz, and I can modulate these at 12 gigahertz, I can do pulse shaping at the repetition rate of the laser. So every single pulse that is generated from the laser, I can make it look different from the one before. So here are some simple results. We took 12 frequency combs on a 12 gigahertz grid. We make the intensity flat. What's the inverse Fourier transform of a flat spectrum? We know it's sine x over x. We measure these signals using what we call dual comb spectroscopy or multi-heterodyne detection, where you can use a slow scope and a slow photodetector to measure femtosecond pulses directly and measure the electric field. This is it right here. There's our sinc squared pulse. And then we impart a static cubic phase across the spectrum. And since we were all in our talks this afternoon, we all know about the Airy function, or the Airy rehealable beam, and this is exactly what you get. in the time domain, classic cubic phase. These waveforms are robust and super stable. And by doing all sorts of tricks, you can do period doubling, anything you want. Arbitrary waveform generation. True arbitrary waveform generation, which is updatable at the repetition rate of the laser. Now here we're just showing you static waveforms, but here is a result showing you dynamic waveforms. So here's a mode-locked pulse train coming in at, unmodulated at 6.25 gigahertz. Here is just 4 frequency combs, and each comb I'm going to modulate this one at 780 megahertz. I'm going to operate this one at 1.5 gigahertz, this one at 2.3 gigahertz, and this one at 3.125 gigahertz. Exactly half the repetition rate of the mode-lock laser. And so with that, things would be periodic on a 1.28 nanosecond scale. We can kind of see this periodicity here, but let's zoom in and see what the heck we have. That's this here. So get a load of this. This pulse became this pulse became that, etc. And even though we're just using 4 simple comb lines, you can easily see that every single pulse is different from the one before that. So we are literally doing pulse shaping at the repetition rate of the laser, which I think anyone in the pulse shaping field with liquid crystal SLMs would have said, that is impossible to do. So now, before I go on, I want to now make a connection, because here we're doing pulse shaping in the time domain. You guys do transverse mode profile shaping. That's what this whole entire conference is. And boy, wouldn't it be great if we combine these technologies. Envision this. So this is my simple vision. Envision this. Assume we have an octave of bandwidth. That means we make single cycle light. Now if I have an octave of bandwidth, that means, and I can kind of do amplitude and phase shaping, I can put transients in my optical intensity that will be single cycle anywhere I want and as closely spaced as I want. Now assuming I could take that and also do space domain shaping with some of these sort of flower modes that we saw, very exotic. And by combining space shaping and time shaping, where the intensities are single cycle, suppose I could focus that into a jet of noble gas and generate attosecond pulses. So now I can have both space shaping and time shaping generating arrays of attosecond beams where I can control the phase and literally have attosecond or extreme UV pulses literally hitting a sample and scanning at the repetition rate of the laser. So you can envision new types of photolithography where you could just use a laser to not just write, but write and scan at the same time at an extremely rapid rate with features on the order of the wavelength of EUV pulses. Now, I'm not saying we all do this right now, and you might say, gee, Peter, we can't do that because of A, B, and C. And you know what that means? What are we doing when someone says we can't do that? What are we doing? We're listening with our good ear. Those tells us the problems we need to solve to make this thing happen. And I really believe that kind of stuff is possible. So I'm almost done. When you're confronted with the challenge, listen with your good ear. People are telling you something. Number 2, work with the physics, not against it. On your head thinking. Turn the problem around. 3, never give up. And finally, this concept about diode lasers are pigs. Well, they are, because diode lasers are practical, ingenious generators of signals. Boom! No, that's okay, it's okay, it's okay, that's okay. The last, boom, there it is, practical, ingenious pigs. So now, Professor Alfano taught me something also. He says, Peter, you gotta have vision. Gotta have a vision. But in order to see, you need some light. Right? So you need light to see. So, Professor Alfano will probably come to me and say, gee, Peter, I don't remember all of those lessons I taught you. I mean, maybe because we're all getting old, our memory is getting bad. But I'd like to point to this obscure, very obscure document, which winds up being my PhD thesis, which at the very end it says, it's easier for those who see the light. And I don't know if Professor Alfano remembers that, but clearly this is in my PhD, page 133, Robert R. Alfano, PJD, 1988. And this is me and Professor Alfano, slightly younger versions of us. And this was on the day, whenever you graduate from and defend, he takes you to have Chinese food downtown on Amsterdam Avenue. That was a ritual. And so there it is. We actually don't look too much different now, I hope. What's that?
We've got a couple more buttons.
That's right. So at that point, I just want to, go back. I just want to thank you all for your attention. Professor Alfano was an outstanding mentor for me. I came through CCNY. It is the free public institution in New York City, and I'm truly indebted and grateful for the opportunities he gave me, which enabled me to go to Belcour and do some really great things there, and that put me on an excellent path to do great things back at UCF in Creole, where I'm from. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'd personally like to thank you, Professor Alfano, for the opportunities you gave me.